What happens when the perfect life is built on a perfect lie? For Eleonora Vance, her world was a gilded cage, a stunning Brooklyn brownstone, a place on every charity board, and a husband, Richard, whose ambition was as celebrated as his charm. She was the silent partner in his ascent, the quiet grace on his arm. But when a single damning discovery revealed the devastating affair he hid in plain sight, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She made a silent vow. She would disappear from his life so completely, he would believe she had simply broken. But she wasn't breaking. She was forging herself anew in the fires of betrayal, waiting for the day she would return, not as the wife he forgot, but as the force of nature that would own his entire world. The air in their Brooklyn Heights brownstone always smelled of something expensive. Sometimes it was the fresh lilies Eleonora arranged on the marble mantelpiece. Other times it was the lingering oaky scent of the vintage Scotch Richard Vance favoured after closing a deal. Tonight it was the cloying fragrance of success. Richard was on the phone in his study, his voice a low, triumphant hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Eleonora, arranging canapes on a slate board, could piece together the conversation from the snippets that escaped the heavy oak door. Multi-billion-dollar merger. A masterstroke. The board is ecstatic. To anyone looking in theirs was a life airbrushed to perfection. Richard was the charismatic CEO of Vance Capital Partners, a private equity firm he had built from the ground up, with a reputation for ruthless surgical precision. At 45, he was the king of his concrete kingdom, handsome, impeccably dressed, and radiating an aura of invincibility. Eleonora, or Ellie as he called her in softer moments, was his perfect counterpart. With a quiet intelligence and a grace that seemed out of place in the sharp-edged world of New York finance, she was the consummate hostess, the supportive wife, the woman who had gracefully stepped away from her own promising career in software engineering at MIT to cultivate their home and social standing. She placed the last olive, adjusted her silk blouse, and caught her reflection in the polished surface of the Sub-Zero refrigerator. Her face, framed by soft brown hair, was serene. Her smile was gentle. But her eyes, if one looked closely, held a flicker of a forgotten fire, a keen intellect that now spent its days managing caterers and charities instead of code and algorithms. The study door opened, and Richard emerged, his face flushed with victory. He was holding a small velvet box, a landmark day, Ellie. An absolute landmark, he said, his voice booming. He crossed the room and took her in his arms, his embrace feeling more performative than passionate. And for my silent partner in all of this. He opened the box. Inside lay a diamond locket, intricate and blindingly brilliant. It was beautiful, it was expensive, and it felt utterly impersonal. Richard, "It's stunning," she said, her voice perfectly pitched to convey grateful surprise. She allowed him to fasten it around her neck, the cold diamonds kissing her skin. "Only the best for you," he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. But as he pulled away, she caught it, a faint, unfamiliar scent clinging to the collar of his custom-made shirt. It was floral sweet and youthfully audacious. It wasn't her perfume. The first crack in the gilded cage had appeared. Over the next few months, the cracks spiderwebbed. They were subtle at first. The late nights at the office became more frequent, justified by the demands of the new merger. The business trips grew longer, his calls home shorter and more perfunctory. He'd sit across from her at dinner, physically present, but mentally a million miles away, his thumb ghosting across the screen of his phone, which was now perpetually face down on the table. Ellie was not a fool. She was a woman who had once navigated complex theorems and designed elegant code. She recognized patterns. The pattern here was one of deceit. She began to notice the name Amber Collins in the periphery of their lives. Amber was Richard's new star analyst, a fiercely ambitious woman in her late 20s with a razor-sharp mind and a portfolio of achievements that Richard lauded at every opportunity. "She's a killer, Ellie," he'd say with admiration. "Reminds me of myself at that age." Ellie met her once at a company gala. Amber was all sharp angles and a predatory smile, dressed in a crimson dress that stood out like a drop of blood against the sea of black tie attire. She shook Ellie's hand, her grip firm, her eyes scanning Ellie from head to toe in a swift, dismissive appraisal. It wasn't the look of a subordinate meeting the boss's wife. It was the look of a rival sizing up the competition. The confirmation didn't come from a conveniently discovered text message or a lipstick-stained collar. It was colder, more corporate, more insulting than that. One rainy Tuesday, while gathering his suits for the dry cleaner, a receipt fell from the pocket of his Tom Ford jacket. It was from the Carlisle Hotel, dated for a night 2 weeks prior, when Richard had supposedly been locked in an all-night negotiation with a firm from Tokyo. The receipt was for a suite room service for 2 and a bottle of Veuve Clicquot Rosé. Her heart didn't pound. It froze. It turned into a solid, heavy block of ice in her chest. The betrayal wasn't just a secret whispered in the dark. It was documented on hotel letterhead, paid for, with the money she had helped him build an empire on. That night, she waited until he was in a deep, Scotch-induced sleep. Her hands, trembling almost imperceptibly, reached for his phone on the bedside table. His thumbprint was the key, but she knew his passcode, the date his first major company went public. It worked. She didn't have to search hard. The message thread was right there, pinned to the top. Amber. Hundreds of messages. Plans, flirtations, shared victories. But it was the photos that shattered her. Photos of them in the Carlisle suite, Amber wearing his dress shirt, toasting the camera with champagne. Photos of them on a business trip to the Hamptons, laughing on a sun-drenched beach. And the last message sent just that afternoon from Amber. "Can't wait for tonight. Our little secret is the best part." Eleonora felt the air leave her lungs in a silent scream. She sank to the floor, the cold wood a stark contrast to the fire raging inside her. The woman in the mirror, the gracious hostess, the supportive wife, she was a ghost. A carefully constructed facade to a life that was a complete and utter fraud. Richard hadn't just broken their vows, he had erased her. He had relegated her to a footnote in his own story, a decorative piece of his success while he built a new narrative with someone else. She looked at her reflection in the dark screen of the phone. The diamond locket he had given her lay against her skin, a cold, mocking weight. In that moment, staring at the face of a woman she no longer recognized, the quiet, gentle Ellie Vance died. And something else, something cold, hard, and patient was born. She would not confront him. She would not give him the satisfaction of a scene, the drama of her tears. He had played a long game of deceit. She would play a longer one. She would not be a victim in his story. She would be the author of his downfall. She would stay silent. For now. The morning after felt like waking up on a different planet. The light filtering through the expensive drapery seemed harsher. The birdsong outside the window mocking. Eleonora went through the motions with the precision of a bomb disposal expert. She made coffee the aroma of which now smelled like hypocrisy. She laid out the Wall Street Journal next to Richard's plate. She smiled when he came downstairs, knotting his tie. "Morning, darling," he said, kissing her cheek. The spot where his lips touched her skin burned. She fought the urge to recoil, to scrub it raw. "Good morning," she replied, her voice even. "Big day today." "Always," he said, oblivious. He scanned the headlines, completely unaware of the cataclysm that had occurred just feet from where he slept. This became her new reality. A life lived behind a mask of placid domesticity. She was an actress in the most demanding role of her life, and her performance was flawless. She hosted his dinner parties, smiling at his colleagues and laughing at his anecdotes, while the knowledge of his betrayal churned like acid in her stomach. She listened to him praise Amber's latest market analysis, her face a perfect portrait of wifely pride. "The girl's a prodigy," he'd say, shaking his head in feigned disbelief. "We're lucky to have her." "She sounds wonderful." Eleonora would reply the words tasting like ash. Her silence was not born of weakness, but of a chilling newfound strength. Every smile she faked, every meal she served, every night, she feigned sleep as he typed out secret messages to his lover. She was gathering intelligence. She was studying him not as a husband, but as an opponent. She listened to his business calls, absorbing the language of leverage acquisitions and hostile takeovers. She read the financial reports he left on his desk, committing to memory the names of board members, key investors, and the structural vulnerabilities of Vance Capital. She realized the affair with Amber wasn't just a sordid fling. It was a symptom of his larger pathology. Richard saw people as assets or liabilities. For 20 years, Ellie had been an asset, the stable, intelligent, beautiful wife who solidified his image. But she had ceased to be useful to his ambition. Amber, young, hungry, and a reflection of his own predatory instincts, was his new, more valuable asset. He wasn't just cheating on a wife. He was upgrading a component of his life's machinery. The true turning point came not in their silent, tense home, but under the glittering chandeliers of the Metropolitan Museum of Art at the annual Financial Leaders Gala. Eleonora was in a midnight blue gown, the picture of elegance. Richard was at his most charming, gliding through the crowd. She watched him from across the room as he spoke with Amber, who was, as always, strategically by his side. It was a stolen moment, a glance between them that no one else would have noticed. It wasn't a look of lust. It was a look of pure, unadulterated conspiracy. A shared glance that said, "Look at all these fools. This is our world to take." In that instant, Eleonora understood. She wasn't just being replaced in his bed. She was being replaced in his empire. The future he was building didn't include her at all. That night, she went home and initiated her own plan, a protocol of quiet, methodical erasure. She started with the locket. The next day, she took it not to a local jeweler, but to a discreet, high-end diamond broker in the city's diamond district, a man known for his silence and his fair prices. She walked out with a cashier's check for a sum that would have staggered the old Ellie. She did the same with every piece of jewelry Richard had ever given her. The anniversary earrings, the birthday tennis bracelet, the just because watches. Each sale felt like shedding a layer of a false skin. These weren't gifts of love. They were payments for her service, and she was cashing them out. She opened a new bank account at a small independent bank under her maiden name, Eleonora Stone. She quietly contacted a lawyer not for a divorce, but for something far more complex, the creation of a blind trust and a series of shell corporations. She remembered a small inheritance from her grandmother, a portfolio of tech stocks she had been advised to sell years ago, but had kept for sentimental reasons. It had grown quietly and steadily into a respectable sum. It was her seed capital. She began to untangle herself from Richard's life with surgical precision. She digitized years of family photos, then packed the physical albums into a storage unit. She made copies of every important financial document she could find: his tax returns, his private investment statements, the architectural blueprints of his corporate headquarters. She was a ghost haunting her own life, collecting the intel she would need for the war to come. Her final 2 weeks in the brownstone were the hardest. She had to maintain the facade while her escape plan was in its final stages. The strain was immense. There were moments she would lock herself in the bathroom, gripping the cold marble sink, her knuckles white, taking deep, shuddering breaths to keep from storming into his study and unleashing the hurricane of fury within her. She chose the day of his next trip to London. He packed his suitcase, whistling. "I'll be back Friday," he said, kissing her goodbye. "Try not to miss me too much." "I'll manage," she said, the double meaning hanging in the air completely lost on him. As soon as his car pulled away, her operation began. She didn't pack clothes or keepsakes. Her entire new life was on a single encrypted hard drive. She had a single suitcase with a few changes of clothes and her laptop. She walked through the silent house, a museum of her former life. She paused in his study, looking at the photos on his desk of them on their wedding day, of him on the cover of Forbes. They were props in a play, and the curtain was finally coming down. She left a simple handwritten note on the perfectly made bed. It read, "Richard, I've gone away for a while. I need some time to think. Don't look for me. Eleonora. No anger. No accusations. No drama." The note was a weapon of confusion. It would make him think she was weak, emotional, perhaps having a breakdown. It would buy her time. He would be annoyed, embarrassed, but he wouldn't suspect the truth. He would never suspect that the wife he saw as a decorative object had just launched a long-term, hostile takeover of his entire existence. She walked out the front door, didn't look back, and took a taxi not to JFK, but to a small private airfield in New Jersey. A chartered jet, paid for by the diamonds he had bought her, was waiting. Her destination, Seattle. A city of rain coffee and technological innovation, a place where Eleonora Vance could die, and someone new could be born. As the jet climbed into the sky, leaving the glittering skyline of New York behind, she felt no sadness, only the cold, clean thrill of a complicated problem finally being solved. The silence was over. The work was about to begin. Seattle was a baptism of grey skies and relentless drizzle, a world away from the sun-drenched arrogance of Manhattan. Eleonora Stone, as she was now exclusively known, traded her silk blouses for practical sweaters and her town car for the city's light rail. She moved into a modest, anonymous apartment in Capitol Hill, a neighborhood buzzing with the energy of startups and dreamers. The anonymity was a balm. Here she wasn't Mrs. Richard Vance. She was no one, and in that nothingness, she found the space to become someone else entirely. Her plan, which she had mentally codenamed the Phoenix Protocol, had 2 phases. Phase 1 was accumulation. Phase 2 was annihilation. She was now deep in Phase 1. Her first call was to a name from her past, a ghost from her days at MIT, Dr. Alistair Finch. Finch was a legend in the computer science department, a reclusive genius who had taught her advanced algorithm design. He had seen a spark in her that few others had a unique ability to see, not just lines of code, but the elegant systems they could create. He had retired years ago, under a cloud of academic politics, disgusted with the commercialization of pure research. She found him living in a secluded house on Bainbridge Island, surrounded by towering pines and stacks of books. He was older, greyer, but his eyes were as sharp as she remembered. "Eleonora Stone," he said, a rare smile crinkling the corners of his eyes as he opened the door. "I always wondered what happened to the most brilliant mind I ever had the misfortune of teaching. I heard you married some corporate raider." "I did," Ellie said, her voice steady. "And now I'm staging my own raid. I need your help, Alistair." Over hours of strong black coffee, she laid it all out. Not the emotional story of betrayal, Finch had no time for that, but the data. She presented her idea, a concept that had been percolating in her mind for years, even in the gilded cage. It was a revolutionary software platform using predictive analytics and machine learning to optimize sustainable energy grids. It could predict energy surpluses and deficits with 98% accuracy, rerouting power in real time to prevent waste and blackouts. It was complex, brilliant, and years ahead of its time. Finch listened, his initial skepticism slowly melting into focused intensity. He peppered her with questions, challenging her assumptions, poking holes in her logic. She met every challenge with a well-reasoned answer. She had spent the last 6 months of her silent life, not just planning her escape, but building the theoretical framework for this venture. "The capital requirements are substantial," he finally said, leaning back. "I have seed money," she said, "from the sale of non-essential assets." Alistair gave a knowing grunt. "Good. The best revenge is not living well. It's building a monopoly and crushing your enemies. Let's get to work." He didn't give her money, but something far more valuable, his credibility and his network. He introduced her to a handful of other disgruntled tech geniuses, brilliant engineers and programmers who had also fled the corporate world. They formed the core of their new company. They named it Aura Innovations. The next 5 years were a brutal, relentless grind. They worked out of a rented garage in Fremont, the center of the universe, fueled by cheap pizza caffeine and a shared fanatical belief in their mission. Ellie was not a CEO in a corner office. She was in the trenches writing code for 18 hours a day, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She was more alive than she had ever been. The intellectual fire that had been banked for 2 decades now roared to life. She was no longer just intelligent, she was formidable. There were failures, a catastrophic server crash that wiped out 3 months of work, a potential investor who tried to steal their intellectual property, a moment they were 2 weeks from bankruptcy, making payroll with their personal credit cards. Through it all, Ellie was the immovable center. Her focus was terrifying. The memory of Richard's and Amber's conspiratorial glance was a permanent image seared into her mind, a source of inexhaustible fuel. Their breakthrough came in year 4. A massive statewide blackout in California exposed the fragility of the existing power grid. Aura's platform was the only viable solution. They secured a pilot program, and its success was immediate and spectacular. Suddenly, Aura Innovations was the hottest tech company on the planet. Venture capital firms that had once scoffed at them were now begging for a meeting. Ellie, however, was strategic. With Alistair's guidance, she took on smart money, retaining majority control. The company exploded. They moved from the garage to a sleek glass and steel campus overlooking Lake Union. Their valuation skyrocketed from thousands to millions, then to billions. With success came a new persona. Eleonora Stone was too soft, too close to the past. On the advice of a shrewd PR consultant, she created an identity for the public stage. She became Lena Volkov. Lena, a shortened, sharper version of Eleonora, and Volkov, the Russian word for wolf. It was a declaration. The lamb was gone. Lena Volkov was a creature of meticulous design. Her soft brown hair was cut into a severe, stylish black bob. Her gentle smiles were replaced with a cool, appraising gaze. Her wardrobe of silk and cashmere was swapped for architectural power suits in shades of charcoal navy and black. She spoke with a quiet, unnerving authority. When Lena Volkov entered a room, there was no question who was in charge. The financial press was obsessed with her. She was the mysterious, reclusive tech billionaire who had come from nowhere. No one could find any history on her before Aura. Her past was a carefully constructed blank slate. 5 years to the day after she had left New York, Aura Innovations went public. The IPO was one of the most successful in NASDAQ history. By the end of the trading day, Lena Volkov's personal net worth was estimated at over $20 billion. She stood in her minimalist office, watching the ticker symbol Aura flash green on the screen. Alistair stood beside her, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "To the Phoenix," he said, handing her a glass. She took it, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Phase 1 is complete, Alistair," she said, her voice a low hum. "It's time to begin Phase 2. She wasn't looking at the NASDAQ ticker anymore. On another monitor, she had another stock pulled up, a company that had been stagnating for the past year. Its performance lackluster, its leadership arrogant and complacent. VCE, Vance Capital Partners. The wolf was coming home, and the hunt was about to begin. While Lena Volkov was building an empire, Richard Vance was presiding over a slowly decaying one. On the surface, Vance Capital was still a behemoth. Richard was still a fixture in the financial pages, his marriage to the ambitious Amber Collins, a lavish Hamptons affair, 2 years after Ellie's disappearance, celebrated as a true power couple merger. He had told everyone his first wife had suffered a mental breakdown, a tragic story that painted him as a long-suffering, sympathetic figure. He almost believed it himself. Ellie's quiet, perplexing departure was a loose thread he preferred not to pull. He wrote her off as a casualty of a world she was too fragile to inhabit. But beneath the polished veneer, Vance Capital was in trouble. Richard's legendary aggression had curdled into arrogance. He was taking bigger risks, his due diligence becoming sloppy. He was surrounded by sycophants, with Amber, now his COO, being the chief enabler. They were insulated by their own success, blind to the changing market. The trouble started subtly. A whisper on the trading floor. A rumor in a back-channel chat room. A ghost was moving through the market. A new mysterious investment entity, known only as Orion Holdings, had appeared. No one knew who was behind it. It was registered in a web of offshore accounts, from the Cayman Islands to Switzerland, making it impossible to trace. Orion's first move was to start buying up Vance Capital's corporate debt from secondary lenders. It was an unglamorous but insidious strategy. Debt ownership gives a creditor leverage, a say in a company's financial health without the publicity of a stock purchase. Richard barely noticed. It was a minor line item in a quarterly report dismissed by his CFO as routine bond trading. Then Orion began its attack on the stock. It didn't launch a full frontal assault. It used high-frequency trading algorithms to make thousands of small surgical trades a day, slowly, almost invisibly, accumulating a position. The algorithms were brilliant, mimicking natural market static, making the accumulation impossible to detect by Vance's standard security protocols. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Richard and Amber were too busy planning their new Aspen ski chalet to notice the shark circling beneath their yacht. The first real alarm bell rang when one of their key institutional investors, a pension fund from California, unexpectedly liquidated its entire 5% stake in Vance Capital. "What the hell happened?" Richard barked at his head of investor relations. "I don't know, sir. They said they got a premium offer from a private buyer, an entity called Orion Holdings. They paid 20% over market value. It made no sense to refuse." Richard slammed his fist on the mahogany desk. "Find out who the hell Orion is." Now. But they couldn't. It was a ghost with impossibly deep pockets. Over the next 3 months, Orion Holdings became Richard's waking nightmare. 2 more institutional investors sold their stakes to Orion. A whisper campaign, seemingly originating from nowhere, began to circulate among analysts questioning Vance Capital's liquidity and highlighting its recent underperforming acquisitions. The stock price began to slide. Amber, ever the aggressor, urged a counterattack. "It's a hostile takeover attempt, Richard. We need to issue new stock to dilute their position. A poison pill, and signal to the market that we're panicking." "It would crater our share price," Richard retorted, the stress showing in the lines around his eyes. He was trapped. Every defensive move he could make would be an admission of weakness. The ghost was smarter than him. It knew his playbook. It anticipated his every move. It felt personal. The final devastating blow came not through the stock market, but through the media. A meticulously researched anonymous report was leaked to the Wall Street Journal. It detailed with irrefutable proof a series of questionable accounting practices at Vance Capital, inflating the value of certain assets to hide losses from a disastrous real estate venture in Dubai, a venture Richard had personally overseen and buried in the books. The article was a bombshell. The SEC immediately launched a formal investigation. Vance Capital's stock plummeted over 40% in a single day. Lenders grew nervous. The edifice of Richard's empire began to tremble. He sat in his vast corner office, the glittering New York skyline, feeling like a judgment against him. Amber was pacing her voice, shrill with panic. "This is a coordinated attack, Richard. Someone is trying to destroy us." "I know that, Amber," he roared. "But who? Who has the money, the sophistication, and the motive to do this?" Just then his private line buzzed. It was his secretary. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The majority stakeholders representing Orion Holdings have called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. They've invoked a clause in the corporate bylaws regarding a crisis of leadership. They are exercising their right to restructure the board and executive team." Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning. Orion wasn't just a stakeholder anymore. They had quietly, systematically, and ruthlessly acquired a controlling interest. They owned him. "Who is representing them?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Who is coming to the meeting?" "They just sent the name, sir," the secretary replied. "She's the CEO of Orion Holdings. Her name is Lena Volkov." Richard didn't recognize the name. It meant nothing to him. He was about to meet the ghost, the architect of his ruin, and he had absolutely no idea he had once shared a bed with her. The boardroom on the 50th floor of the Vance Capital building was a theater of anxiety. The long, polished mahogany table reflected the grim faces of the board members, men and women who had ridden Richard's coattails to immense wealth and were now watching it all burn. Richard stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of forced composure, a general preparing for his unconditional surrender. Amber sat to his right, her usual predatory confidence replaced by a brittle, nervous energy. She kept smoothing her dress, a telltale sign of her agitation. The air was thick with the silent ticking of the expensive clock on the wall. 10:00 a.m. came and went. The representative from Orion was late, a calculated power move that frayed everyone's nerves even further. At 10:05, the double doors of the boardroom opened. Everyone turned. A woman walked in, flanked by 2 lawyers, who looked as if they were carved from granite. She was not what they expected. There was no corporate swagger, no boastful energy. There was only an unnerving stillness, a presence that consumed all the oxygen in the room. She was dressed in a flawlessly tailored charcoal grey suit, her black hair cut in a sharp geometric bob that framed a face of pale, serious beauty. Her eyes, a shade of blue, so dark they were almost violet, swept across the room, missing nothing, giving away nothing. This was Lena Volkov. Richard felt a strange, unsettling flicker of recognition, a phantom limb of a memory he couldn't grasp. He dismissed it as a trick of the light. "Miss Volkov," he said, his voice straining for a tone of authority he no longer possessed. "I'm Richard Vance. We've been expecting you." She didn't smile. She walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, the seat of power, and sat down. Her lawyers took their places behind her. She placed a single slim tablet on the table in front of her. "I know who you are, Mr. Vance," she said. Her voice was the biggest shock. It was low, calm, and exquisitely controlled, yet it carried an echo of something familiar that made the hairs on Richard's arms stand on end. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries." Lena continued her gaze, moving from one board member to the next, a queen reviewing her newly conquered subjects. Orion Holdings now controls 54% of the voting stock in this company. As such, we have the authority to make immediate and sweeping changes. My associates are distributing the new preliminary prospectus. You will find the details within. Her lawyers began passing out thick documents. A stunned silence filled the room as the board members began to read. "The first motion," Lena said, her voice cutting through the rustling paper, "is the immediate removal of Richard Vance as CEO and chairman of the board." A collective gasp went through the room. Richard's face went white. "The second motion," she continued, her eyes locking onto Amber, "is the termination for cause of the Chief Operating Officer, Amber Collins, pending a full internal audit of her expense reports and her role in the Dubai venture." Amber shot to her feet. "You can't do this. This is my life's work. This is—" "Sit down, Ms. Collins," Lena said, her voice dropping a half octave laced with steel. It was not a request. Amber, stunned by the sheer force of will in that command, sank back into her chair, her face a mess of disbelief and fury. Richard finally found his voice. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Why are you doing this, to destroy a company out of spite? What have we ever done to you?" Lena Volkov leaned forward slightly. The movement was small, but it felt seismic. She looked directly at Richard, and for the first time she allowed a flicker of something other than ice to show in her eyes. It was a dark, ancient memory. "You ask what you've done to me," she said. softly. She tapped her tablet, and the large screen on the boardroom wall, usually used for presentations, flickered to life. An image appeared. It was a photo of Richard and Amber laughing, toasting with champagne in a hotel room. The Carlisle. Richard stared, his blood turning to ice. He remembered that night. It was the night he'd bought Ellie the diamond locket. Another image flashed on the screen. A receipt. For a suite room service for two, a bottle of Veuve Clicquot rosé. He finally really looked at the woman sitting at the other end of the table. He saw past the severe haircut, the power suit, the cold fury. He saw the shape of her face, the curve of her lips, the intelligence in her eyes that he had chosen to ignore for so many years. The familiar echo in her voice clicked into place. His world tilted on its axis. Ellie. He whispered the name, a ghost on his lips. It was impossible. It couldn't be. Ellie was fragile. Ellie was broken. Ellie was gone. Lena Volkov allowed a small, cold smile to touch her lips. It didn't reach her eyes. Ellie is gone, she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the silent, shocked room. You made sure of that. I am what you created in her place. She stood up, her full, terrifying power now on display. You built your success on the belief that people are assets to be used and discarded, she said, her voice resonating with years of suppressed rage, now perfectly honed into a weapon. You underestimated me. You dismissed me. You thought I was just a part of the decor in the life you were building with her. She gave a curt, dismissive nod toward the shell-shocked Amber. And the ultimate irony, Richard, she continued delivering the killing blow, is how I funded my return. The seed money for Aura Innovations, the company that gave me the capital to create Orion Holdings, didn't come from some secret benefactor. She reached up and touched her neck where a locket once lay. It came from the sale of every diamond, every watch, every bauble you ever gave me to placate your guilt. I sold the locket. I sold the bracelets. I sold the earrings. You paid for this, Richard, every last penny. You funded your own demise. The truth of it, the sheer poetic brutality of it, sucked the very soul from Richard's body. He stumbled back, gripping the table for support, his face a canvas of utter devastation. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered in business. He had been undone completely and existentially by the woman he had thrown away. Lena Volkov looked around the room at the stunned faces, her work complete. Vance Capital is dissolved effective immediately, she declared. Its viable assets will be absorbed by a new subsidiary of Orion. The rest will be liquidated. You are all dismissed. Security will escort you from the building. She turned without a backward glance at the ruins of the man and the empire she had just dismantled and walked toward the door. The reckoning was over. The implosion of Vance Capital wasn't just news. It was a feeding frenzy. The story ripped through the financial world with the force of a hurricane, a shocking morality tale for the modern age. Vultures in the form of journalists and industry gossips circled hungrily, picking apart the carcass of Richard Vance's reputation. The headlines were brutal and relentless. The Ghostwife's Gambit. How a billionaire nobody saw coming dismantled a Wall Street titan. From the bedroom to the boardroom. The story of Lena Volkov. For Richard, the descent was a dizzying, terrifying plunge into a new reality. His world, once cushioned by wealth and deference, had become hard and sharp-edged. His phone, which had once buzzed incessantly with calls from the global elite, fell silent. Former colleagues and friends, men with whom he'd shared cigars and multi-million-dollar deals, now crossed the street to avoid him, their gazes averted as if his failure were a communicable disease. Paparazzi haunted the entrance to his and Amber's Upper East Side apartment, their camera flashes like machine gun fire capturing his public disgrace. Amber, who had attached herself to his power like a remora, proved incapable of navigating its absence. Her ambition, once a sharp tool, became a shrill instrument of panic. She tried to distance herself from him, leaking stories that painted Richard as the sole architect of the firm's downfall. But the narrative of the vengeful wife was too powerful. Amber was irrevocably cast as the other woman, the usurper who got her just desserts. When the SEC, armed with the impeccably organized evidence provided by Orion Holdings, froze their personal assets pending the fraud investigation, her loyalty evaporated completely. She packed her bags, her final words to him, not of love or support, but a venomous tirade about how he had ruined her life. He was left alone in a cavernous apartment he could no longer afford, surrounded by the ghosts of a life he had stolen and then lost. In stark contrast to this chaos, Lena Volkov operated with the serene, methodical calm of a surgeon. She did not linger in New York to savor her victory. The day after the takeover, she was on a flight back to Seattle. For her, the demolition of Vance Capital was complete. Now came the careful, dispassionate work of salvage. In the sleek headquarters of Aura Innovations, she and Alistair Finch spent days poring over the assets of her former husband's company. "His private equity division is a mess," Alistair grumbled, pointing at a screen filled with red. "Over-leveraged, poorly vetted. He became a gambler, not an investor. But his infrastructure advisory group is sound." Lena countered, her eyes scanning a different spreadsheet. "The team is brilliant, and their portfolio of renewable energy projects is undervalued. They were starved of capital because Richard diverted funds to his vanity projects." She wasn't gloating. There was no hint of triumph in her voice. It was the detached, analytical tone of a CEO maximizing value. She was a creator, and she was sifting through the rubble to find anything worth building with. She structured a plan to absorb the viable teams and assets into a new, clean division of Orion Holdings, offering generous terms to the employees she wanted to keep. The toxic debt and fraudulent ventures were quarantined and left to be dismantled by the bankruptcy courts. The name Vance Capital was not just defeated, it was meticulously and permanently erased from the lexicon of American finance. A month into this new chapter, a thick envelope arrived at her office, having been routed through a chain of legal firms. It was from Richard. Her executive assistant, aware of the sender's identity, handled it as if it were radioactive. Lena took it into her private office, overlooking the calm waters of Lake Union, and read it. The letter was not what she expected. There were no pleas for money, no threats, no angry recriminations. It was the rambling, broken script of a defeated man, filled with self-pity, but ending with a single clear request: 10 minutes of her time. "Don't do it," Alistair warned her when she told him. "It's a trap, not a financial one, a psychological one. He'll try to appeal to the woman you used to be. He'll look for a crack in your armor. Why give him the satisfaction?" "Because this isn't for him," Lena replied, her gaze distant. "It's for me. I need to close the final page of the book myself. I need to see the ghost and know for a fact that it can no longer haunt me." She agreed, setting the terms herself. The location would be the Seattle Public Library, a masterpiece of glass and steel, a place of structure, knowledge, and public transparency. It was the antithesis of the shadowy private rooms where Richard had conducted his betrayals. He was already there when she arrived, sitting at a small table in the vast, sunlit atrium. The change in him was shocking. It was more than the cheap, ill-fitting suit or the haunted look in his eyes. The innate, unshakable confidence that had been his defining feature was gone, replaced by a deep, cellular weariness. He looked like a man who hadn't truly slept in weeks. His posture slumped, not in relaxation, but in utter defeat. She approached the table, her quiet footsteps making no sound on the polished concrete floor. He looked up, and for a moment he seemed to see the Ellie of 20 years ago, and his face contorted in a mask of pain. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. She gave a curt, silent nod, taking the seat opposite him. An abyss of shared history and scorched earth lay between them. I know apologies are worthless," he began, stumbling over the words. "What I did to you, to our marriage. It was monstrous. I was arrogant. I was a fool." He looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "I've lost everything. The company, the money. Amber is gone. It's all gone." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "I just have to know. All of this. Aura Orion, this incredible, terrifying thing you built. Was it all just for him? Was it all just to destroy me?" Lena remained perfectly still, letting his question hang in the air, a final pathetic attempt to place himself at the center of her universe. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, measured, and devoid of the passion he had perhaps hoped to provoke. "When I first left," she began, "yes, the anger was the only thing I had. It was the fuel. I would lie awake in a strange apartment, in a strange city, and replay moments in my head. The scent of her perfume on your collar, the look you two shared at the Met Gala, that chilling conspiratorial glance that told me I was already obsolete. I used that rage. It kept me warm. It powered me through 18-hour days of writing code until my fingers bled." She leaned forward, her dark eyes pinning him in place. "But then a funny thing happened, Richard. The problem I was trying to solve, the intricate, beautiful challenge of building the Aura platform, it became more interesting than you were. The thrill of finding an elegant solution to a complex algorithm was more satisfying than any fantasy of revenge. The joy of creating something real, something that would last, something that had a purpose beyond accumulating wealth. It slowly burned the anger away. It wasn't a replacement for my hatred of you. It simply made my hatred of you irrelevant." She sat back, a picture of calm authority. "This entire enterprise stopped being about you years ago. It became about me. It was about rediscovering the person I was before I subsumed my life into yours. The person who loved mathematics, who saw the world as a system to be understood and improved. You didn't just cheat on me, Richard. You committed a far greater sin in your own worldview. You acquired an asset and failed to understand its true value. You took a scientist with a formidable mind and tried to turn her into a decorative hostess. You dismissed, you diminished, and you discarded. You underestimated me." She rose from her chair, her presence commanding. The finality of the moment was absolute. "The takeover of your company wasn't an act of emotional revenge," she stated, delivering the final clinical verdict. "It was a market correction. A stronger, more innovative, and more valuable entity acquired a weaker, decaying one. It was just business. Something you, of all people, should understand." He stared at her, speechless. There was no argument to be made. He had been beaten, not by his wife's anger, but by his own flawed logic. He was a bad investment, and she had corrected the market. Without another word, Lena turned and walked away. Her heels clicked with sharp, definitive purpose on the floor as she moved toward the library's glass exit. She didn't look back at the broken man, sitting amidst the towering shelves of human knowledge. She stepped out into the crisp Seattle air, the future of Aura Innovations laid out before her, a landscape of her own making. The book on Richard Vance was closed, its ashes scattered, and she was finally completely free. And so Eleonora Vance's story comes to a close. But it's not just a story about revenge. It's a testament to the fire that lies dormant within us, waiting for the right moment to ignite. It's about transforming the deepest betrayal into the ultimate self-reclamation. She didn't just take his fortune. She unlocked her own, proving that our greatest power is not what others give us, but what we build for ourselves. Her journey from a silent, heartbroken wife to a boardroom titan is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to rewrite your own story, to become the hero of your own life. What did you think of Eleonora's incredible transformation? Was her final act justice or just cold revenge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of ultimate vindication resonated with you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and make sure you subscribe for more tales of justice and unforgettable drama.